This episode contains highly distressing themes and descriptions of sexual violence. This podcast is intended for a mature audience. Listener caution is advised. A forensic review of the unsolved murders of two young women who were killed in 1987 turns up new evidence. Genetic genealogy tests lead to one man who left DNA at both crime scenes. During a search of the suspect's home, investigators learned that he not only evaded justice for the murders for over 3 decades, but the killer had continued to offend in the most horrific manner.
I'd like to say it was the stuff of nightmares, to be perfectly honest.
We could not have imagined what we found and what we uncovered in relation to further offending by him.
I've never come across anything like it, numbers, nature of offending, and I don't know anybody who has, be they police or other prosecutors.
Welcome to Season 9, Episode 3 of They Walk Among Us, a podcast dedicated to UK true crime. Several unmarked police cars quietly roll to a stop under the hazy glow of streetlights outside a red brick property on Alder Close in Heathfield, East Sussex. It was early, around 5:20 a.m. on December 3rd, 2020. Kent police officers gathered on the driveway while they waited for the occupant. An elderly man opened the white PVC door and appeared calm as investigators filed inside. He casually told them that his wife was upstairs in bed, but she would be getting up for work soon. As he stepped back to sit on the sofa in the living room, one of the officers told the man why they were there.
We're from Kent Police and we're investigating the murders of Wendy Knell and Caroline Pierce in 1987. Okay? As part of that investigation, you've been linked as a suspect, both geographically and forensically. Okay? If you listen to what my colleague's going to say to you.
All right, David, you're under arrest on suspicion of the murders of Wendy Knell and Caroline Pierce in 1987. Do you understand? Yes. You do not have to say anything, but it may harm your defence if you do not mention, when questioned, something which you later rely on in court. Anything you do say may be given in evidence. You are being arrested to secure and preserve evidence by means of questioning, so we can conduct searches, so forensic samples can be obtained, and to prevent your disappearance. Do you understand? Okay.
From the outside, 66-year-old David Fuller did not typically fit the profile of a murderer. But who does? He had been married 3 times. There was no history of domestic violence within his relationships. Fuller and his current partner Marla had been married for over 20 years and had a son. People who knew David Fuller said he was a quiet, friendly man, hardly someone who would evoke suspicion of doing the horrific things he was being arrested for. Once Fuller was transported to the station, a buccal swab was taken to be compared with the DNA on file. As investigators waited for the results, Fuller was confronted with the facts of the case. Ian Plass was surprised to receive a phone call from his girlfriend's mother on the morning of June 23, 1987. Pam Knell seemed anxious and asked Ian if Wendy was with him. Wendy and Ian had watched television together at his mother's the night before, but he had dropped her home on his motorbike shortly after 11 p.m. Staff at the photo processing shop where Wendy worked as a manager had called her mother that morning when she didn't arrive to start her shift. They had received no response from Wendy when they telephoned her. Ian offered to drive to Wendy's bedsit to ensure she was okay. Pam also called her husband Bill and left him a voicemail letting him know what was happening. Pulling up outside 14 Guildford Road in Tunbridge Wells, Kent, Ian Plass got off his motorbike and walked up to the door where Wendy had stood waving goodbye 12 hours earlier. With each unanswered knock and ring of the doorbell, Ian became more concerned about his girlfriend. Ian rushed to an alleyway behind the bedsit and peered through a fanlight window into Wendy's bedroom. Wendy's duvet was bundled at the end of her bed, and Ian could see Wendy's feet protruding from underneath. When she didn't respond to her name being called, Ian had no choice but to clamber through the unlocked window. He later described what he saw. Once in, I just stood there. I recall there was blood somewhere. I can't say where. I could see Wendy's head sticking out from the top of the duvet. The rest of her body was covered by the duvet. I moved closer and stroked her head first. I pulled the duvet just back to her shoulders. She was laying on her left side and facing the wall. I lifted her right arm up and pulled one of her eyelids. She didn't move. I couldn't believe she had gone. "25-year-old Wendy Ann Knell was brought up in Tunbridge, Kent by her parents Pam and Bill. Wendy and her siblings Philip and Jane attended Longmead Primary and Hugh Christie Secondary School before Wendy went on to West Kent College to train as a hotel receptionist. In November 1983, Wendy married Andrew Wiles at Tunbridge Parish Church. The couple had met at a party. Andrew recalled, "She was a very popular girl but fairly reserved. The strongest drink she would touch was bitter lemon. She didn't need alcohol to join in the spirit of things. It was a happy atmosphere she looked for." Although they subsequently parted ways, the split was amicable. Wendy and Andrew were young and realized they wanted different things. Andrew said, "We were overtaken by the idea of getting a house and building a home for ourselves. And then Wendy so much wanted children and I wasn't overly keen. I wanted to enjoy life before I started a family. I was more interested in building up the house, and Wendy wanted to save up for babies. When we split up, there was no animosity. If there was any conflict, it was over which one of us would keep the cats. But that was all." Following the divorce, Wendy began working for Super Snaps, a photo processing chain store. In 1986, Wendy was promoted to the position of manager in the Camden Road branch in Tunbridge Wells. She had moved into a basement bedsit on Guildford Road. Wendy's co-workers described her as a happy-go-lucky, generous young woman who enjoyed her work and loved her family, especially her niece and nephew. She was in a happy relationship with Ian Plass, whom she had met through her father, Bill. Bill and Ian both worked as bus drivers and got on well. Ian later said that he had intended to propose to Wendy on a trip to Paris, but he never got the chance. After finding Wendy Knell's body, then leaving in a panic back through the window, Ian ran to the fire station just over 100 yards from Wendy's bedsit. Investigators from Kent Police CID arrived soon after and cordoned off the scene. Bloodstains were found above the headboard, illustrating how a blunt object had been swung to inflict blows to Wendy's head as she lay sleeping. Wendy was found lying sideways across the bed. Her hair was spread across a pink towel on top of a pillow. Beneath the pillow was Wendy's alarm clock, which had been set for 6:30 a.m. A duvet had been draped over her body, and her clothes were piled at the end of the bed. The motorbike leathers she wore while out with her partner Ian were hanging over a chair. Blood had seeped through the pillow from a Y-shaped cut at the back of Wendy's head. Although there were no skull fractures, she had bleeding on the right side of her brain and had swelling and small scratches on her neck. Her eyes were bloodshot, and there was petechia in the lining of her mouth, consistent with asphyxiation. The scratches on her neck were likely caused by her own nails as someone strangled her. Wendy's cause of death was listed as compression of the neck and a subarachnoid hemorrhage. There was also evidence of a sexual assault, and the pathologist Dr. Michael Heath believed she had been killed sometime between midnight and 5 a.m. A large blood stain on the carpet indicated that her body had been moved. This theory was supported by the presence of another head injury likely caused when her head was hit against the hard floor. The second post-mortem concluded that Wendy had potentially been sexually assaulted after she died. The only items missing from the bedsit were Wendy's diary and a set of keys. Attached to the keys were distinctive keyrings, including a cowbell Wendy had got as a souvenir from Austria decorated with red, yellow, blue and green wool, and a brass plate engraved with the words Woman of the Year. As the front door had been locked, investigators believed that the assailant was either someone Wendy knew well enough to bring inside the property, or someone who had climbed through a window that wouldn't fully close. Although there was semen found during the post-mortem examination and at the scene, DNA analysis would not be routine practice for years to come. The only evidence the police could compare to a suspect was a fingerprint recovered from a plastic bag behind Wendy's bed and a bloody shoe print found on a piece of clothing on her bedroom floor. It was believed to have come from a Clark's branded trainer. Wendy's father Bill arrived at the bedsit when he heard the voicemail from his wife Pam. He had no idea what was happening until an officer told him that the woman inside had died. Reports of peeping Toms and prowlers in the area were looked into, and a witness claimed to have seen a man peering into the window of a nearby flat at around 10:30 p.m. on the night Wendy was killed. Someone also reported seeing a peeping Tom 2 hours later on Grove Hill Road nearby, and Wendy's neighbours recalled a blue or grey-coloured Talbot Horizon backfiring on the street just after 1 a.m. The night before Wendy was murdered, a man had called at a neighbouring flat and told the woman who was living there, "You shouldn't leave your window open at night, especially in the bedroom." A photo fit of the individual was released during a Crime Watch appeal. He was described as being in his mid-20s, over 6 feet tall with a thin build, dark hair and a mustache. Kent police set up a hotline and appealed to members of the public to come forward with any information. They also wanted to speak with people who knew Wendy socially or through her work as Super Snaps. Bill Knell made a televised plea for information about his daughter's murder. He said, "People who go around doing this sort of thing don't deserve to live. It's such a waste. We haven't only lost a daughter, we have lost the chance of grandchildren. At 25, she had her whole life ahead of her. Anyone with daughters must want to help us because their daughters could be next." By mid-August, investigators had interviewed over 3,000 people, and DCI Ian Humphreys said that he believed the killer was still in Tunbridge Wells. After consulting with a forensic psychologist, the detective added, "We now have a clearer picture of the man we are looking for. He is a sadist, and the only motive he had for murder was a sexual one." When a woman was attacked in her own home and another woman went missing in November, The police feared Wendy's killer had struck again. "20-year-old Caroline Pierce was an only child and fiercely independent. Eager to forge her own path, she had moved out of the home she shared with her mother Katrina and got a job at Buster Brown's, an American-style bar and restaurant. By November 1987, Caroline was employed as the manager of their Camden Road branch in Tunbridge Wells. Caroline had moved into a ground-floor bedsit in Grosvenor Park a month earlier, after separating from her boyfriend Andrew. The property was at the end of a cul-de-sac just off Grosvenor Road, next to Woodbury Park Cemetery. The property had been rented by a former co-worker who moved to Australia. Caroline knew the woman who lived there before had had trouble with break-ins and peeping Toms. Aware of the reports about prowlers in the area, Caroline had been vigilant and installed new locks on the windows in her bedsit. She had also told her ex-boyfriend Andrew that she was scared to be alone because she believed someone had been looking in through her window. On November 24th, Caroline finished her shift at Buster Brown's and met some co-workers for a meal. After having a few drinks in the Greyhound pub, the group went to the Il Piccolo restaurant on Camden Road next to Buster Brown's. Caroline then got a taxi from the restaurant to her bedsit just before midnight. Soon after, neighbours in Grosvenor Park heard a woman's terrified screams. When Caroline Pierce didn't turn up for work the next day, her co-workers were immediately concerned for her well-being. Her boss, Kerry Brown, went to Caroline's home on Grosvenor Park. After knocking at the door and receiving no answer, the police were contacted. Describing her employee as dependable and conscientious, Kerry told the Tunbridge Wells Courier, "Caroline has never been late for work and never missed a shift. It is totally out of character that she should disappear in this way. She has never done it before, and all the staff are dreadfully worried about her. I found her totally reliable, particularly with families, because she was marvellous with children." Caroline Pierce was from the area and attended Tunbridge Wells Girls' Grammar School until the age of 16. After that, she began working at a restaurant in the Mount Edgecombe Hotel. Speaking about his former employee, David Bernard said, "She undertook a good many duties while she was working at Laia Loche and was involved in housekeeping, then kitchen craft, passed her city and guild examinations and worked as a waitress. When she was 18, she learned bar work and about wines. I personally thought she had a great future in the business." Caroline's mother, Katrina, was devastated by her daughter's disappearance, especially as they had just begun to repair their relationship that had been fractured by teenage rebellion. Katrina made an emotional plea for her daughter to get in touch to let her know she was safe. They had planned to go Christmas shopping together in Mount Pleasant and arranged to meet on November 27th, but by that time Caroline had vanished. Over the 3 weeks that followed, searches continued for 20-year-old Caroline, who was described as being 5 feet 7 inches tall with a slim build, dark brown shoulder-length hair, and brown eyes. As Caroline Pierce's loved ones sought answers, Wendy Knell's funeral was held on December 8th at St. Stephen's Church in Tunbridge. A memorial fund was set up to raise money for the premature baby care unit at Pembury Hospital. Wendy's mother, Pam, said, "She loved babies and never lived to have one of her own. Perhaps by purchasing a piece of new equipment, We can save a few more babies. That's what she would have wanted. Six days after Wendy Knell's funeral, farm worker John Minnis was cultivating a field in St Mary in the Marsh on Romney Marshes when he noticed something in a ditch next to the road. It was shortly before 3 p.m. John thought someone had dumped a dummy or blow-up doll in the water-filled ditch. As he got closer, he was horrified to realize that it was the body of a young woman. She was naked apart from a pair of tights. Officers from Kent CID, including Detective Chief Superintendent Duncan Gibbons, were dispatched to the scene. It was noted the body was on its side with the left hand on the bank of the ditch. Although it was clear that the young woman had been dead for some time, and her body had been partially submerged in water, investigators believed they had found Caroline Pierce. As the remains were removed for a post-mortem examination, over 50 officers scoured the remote countryside near the scene while a helicopter was sent up to conduct an aerial search. Specialist officers waded through the 4 inches of water in the ditch. They were collecting silt and mud samples in order to determine how long the body had been there. In the early hours of the morning, Katrina Frost received the call she had been dreading and had to travel to the morgue to view the body. She identified the victim as her only child, Caroline Pierce. During the post-mortem, the pathologist noted 7 wounds to the top and back of Caroline's head that were consistent with blunt force trauma. Like Wendy Knell, Caroline had sustained Y-shaped cuts to her scalp, but she also had deep bruising on her forehead and body that indicated a prolonged attack. Caroline had desperately tried to defend herself. Her arms and hands were bruised, and her left thumb had been fractured as she attempted to protect her head and face. Marks on her throat were consistent with strangulation by someone with their arm locked around her neck, so the pathologist listed her cause of death as asphyxia and traumatic head injury. Evidence also indicated that she had been sexually assaulted. Caroline's body had been found almost 40 miles from her home, 21 days after it was believed she had been murdered. Neighbours Kenneth and Janet Miller, who lived opposite Caroline's bedsit, recalled hearing high-pitched screams followed by a faint cry late on November 24th. When Janet looked outside, she couldn't see anyone, but she did hear a few quiet sobs. Dozens of officers from the Kent Constabulary conducted inquiries in the area near where the body had been found. The location was not visible from the roadside. They believed Caroline's body had been dumped soon after she went missing. Similarities between the victims and the way they died led investigators to consider that Wendy Knell and Caroline Pierce had been killed by the same person. A spokesman from the Kent Police told the Western Daily Press, "We obviously have to consider that possibility. There are similarities. Now both girls who lived alone in flats in Tunbridge Wells. Both died from head injuries and were sexually assaulted. And it happens that they both worked in the same street, Camden Road." In both cases, the victims' keys had not been recovered. 5 days after Caroline Pierce went missing, a 34-year-old was the victim of a sex attack in her flat by a man carrying a knife. His face was obscured by a pair of tights. After breaking into the property in the early hours of the morning, the man threatened the woman with the blade before raping her. The attack lasted almost an hour, but the victim was able to give a description of her assailant. He was said to be in his 30s, 5 feet 10 inches tall with a large build. He had been wearing a black bomber jacket, light-coloured trousers and leather gloves. Eventually, a 25-year-old man was arrested and charged with sexual assault, but there was no evidence to link him to the murders of Wendy Knell and Caroline Pierce. In most missing persons or murder inquiries, the first people to be interviewed are those closest to the victim, including their family members or romantic partners. Caroline's former boyfriend Andrew was extensively questioned about her death. He later recalled, "It was like a nightmare. It was bad enough that Caroline was dead. To make things worse, I was being questioned by the police. It was horrible having the finger pointed at me. I never gave up hope that she would walk through the door. I kept thinking she would come back." An incident room was set up in Lydd on Romney Marsh, and a police spokesman told the Folkestone Herald, "We are making house-to-house inquiries in a bid to find any people who have a connection with both Tunbridge Wells and Romney Marsh. We have found a number of people who do have a connection with the two places. There is a possibility that the murderer has some knowledge of Romney Marsh." Locals believed that someone had hidden in the overgrown cemetery behind Caroline's bedsit, so investigators began searching the cemetery grounds for any clues. Women were urged not to leave Christmas parties alone, and taxi drivers were asked to ensure female passengers had made it home safely before picking up their next fare. On December 29th, a reconstruction of Caroline's last movements was undertaken by a female police officer. WPC Amanda Lawrence got out of a taxi at Caroline's bedsit close to midnight and began screaming. Explaining what they were trying to achieve, Detective Inspector John McCann said, "We asked WPC Lawrence to scream 4 times in 4 different places. The idea was for the people who heard the screams, which might have been Caroline's on November 24th, to tell us which of Amanda's screams were from the most likely position." Caroline would have got out of the taxi and walked down a narrow lane between her home and a cemetery wall to the steep steps that led to her front door. There was no light on the side of the property, and the closest street light was over 100 feet from the entrance of the bedsit. A candlelit vigil was held in the days that followed by members of the Tunbridge Wells Women's Group. They walked from the Pantiles to Crescent Road, then Camden Road, before stopping at the town hall for 2 minutes of silence to remember Wendy and Caroline. By April 1988, over 10,000 people had been interviewed, and over 500 statements had been collected by the 35 officers working on the case full-time. However, they found no trace of the killer. As forensic technology advanced in the 1990s and early 2000s, a complete DNA profile was obtained from semen samples found at Wendy Knell's murder scene. On the 20th anniversary of the murders, the police announced the breakthrough, but there were no matches on the national DNA database. Over the years that followed, convicted killers Peter Tobin and Levi Belfield were considered suspects. However, they were ultimately eliminated from the inquiry. In 2010, men in Tunbridge Wells were asked to provide DNA samples to compare with the DNA found in 1987. A cold case team had been set up by Kent Police, and Wendy Knell and Caroline Pierce's murders were being reviewed. Detective Chief Inspector Dave Withers told the Kent and Sussex Courier, "We are visiting people who are of interest to the inquiry, and with their consent obtaining samples of their DNA for comparison to that found at the crime scene. This is the simplest way to eliminate someone from the investigation." 500 men were subsequently cleared of any involvement. Speaking about the victims' families and the force's dedication to catching the killer, DCI Withers added, "There are always relatives who want answers, and we have a duty to them as well as a duty to the victims. The person responsible might still be offending, and we need to protect the public." Around the 25th anniversary of Wendy Knell's murder, her parents spoke out about the effect the horrific crime had had on their lives. Bill said, "It's driven us apart as man and wife. My wife can't bear me near her. She's afraid of anything physical. If I put my arm around her, she'll say, 'Don't do that.' Before, we had the perfect life. But from that day, it's just a stressful life. You just go from day to day and try to cope." Pam went on to say, "I had just turned 50 when we lost Wendy, and everybody told me life was going to begin. But it ended." Wendy had been murdered on her father's 53rd birthday, so it was no longer a joyous occasion. Caroline Pierce's parents had moved to Spain and tried to stay out of the public eye as it was too painful to relive their trauma. Bill and Pam Knell appealed to anyone with information to come forward. Detective Chief Inspector Rob Vincent warned the murderer, "You should spend every day looking over your shoulder because we're still looking, and we're going to find you." 4 years later, Bill Knell was diagnosed with incurable cancer. He said that he just wanted closure before he passed away. In March 2017, Bill told the Kent and Sussex Courier, "They say time is a healer, but it's not. It is always in the back of your mind. The hospital has said they can't do any more for me, and I would really like him caught before the end comes. I want to know, why did he have to kill her?" 2 months later, Bill died at a hospice surrounded by his family. Recounting his final moments, Pam said, "It was so hard for him, for both of us. I told him at the hospice because he kept hanging on, 'Why don't you let go and find Wendy?' And then he died around midnight. He is up there with Wendy and all his other brothers and sisters because his brother died 5 days after him." A forensic review of the murders of Wendy Knell and Caroline Pierce was opened in 2019. Sperm cells were found on Caroline's tights, and a partial DNA profile was created. This profile was compared with the DNA evidence collected in Wendy Knell's case. After 32 years, the murders were forensically linked. In October 2020, investigators used familial DNA searches to narrow down the suspect pool. A list of 1,000 names was collated by the National Crime Agency as they had similar elements in their DNA. By profiling each person's geographic location and age, they were able to reduce the list to 90 people. One man whose DNA was on the National DNA Database had a brother who had lived in Tunbridge Wells and was 32 years old at the time of the murders. His name was David Fuller. Once David Fuller was in custody, He was taken to Tunbridge Police Station to be interviewed. A DNA sample was collected. In response to questions about the murders, Fuller denied knowing the victims or even knowing about the highly publicised cases. Officers searching his home in Heathfield, East Sussex, found evidence to support the fact that he had not only lived on Upper Grosvenor Road, but he visited Buster Brown's restaurant and had photos developed as super snaps. Images of Fuller in the 1980s pictured him wearing a pair of Clark's Super Trek trainers, the type of shoe that had left a bloody print on a blouse in Wendy Knell's bedroom. However, those photos were not the only ones found in Fuller's home, and they were far from the most disturbing discovery. David Lewis Fuller was born in Deal, Kent in 1954 to Evelyn and Raymond Fuller. Along with his siblings, he briefly moved with his parents to South Africa before settling in Portsmouth. Fuller got an apprenticeship as an electrician with the Ministry of Defence and married his first wife Gillian in April 1972. A year later, Fuller was convicted of 3 counts of burglary. He broke into houses by making a hole in the window to unlatch it. Distinctive impressions from the shoes he had been wearing led to his arrest, but he didn't receive a custodial sentence. He completed his 4-year City and Guilds electrical technician apprenticeship at Her Majesty's Dockyard in Portsmouth in 1976. Gillian and Fuller went on to have 2 children together, but the marriage broke down. According to Fuller, Gillian was unfaithful, and after their divorce, she and the children moved away and he didn't see them often. Fuller moved to Tunbridge in Kent, where he did odd jobs and worked at an electronics company on the High Street. It was at the pub in Tunbridge where he met his second wife, Sally. Sally was a house mother at Broomhill School, a school for girls with moderate learning difficulties in Tunbridge Wells. The couple had a house on the school grounds, less than 3 miles from the homes of Wendy Knell and Caroline Pierce. Sally wasn't always home. She usually stayed with the children at the school on weeknights. In 1987, the same year the murders were committed, Fuller and Sally were members of the West Kent Cyclist Touring Club. They had gone on a ride by Romney Marsh in October of that year, 2 months before Caroline Pierce's body was found on that same route. Fuller's second marriage broke down when Sally allegedly had an affair with a member of their bike club. By this point, Fuller was working as an electrical maintenance craftsman at Kent and Sussex Hospital. Although this was an NHS role, background checks failed to detect his prior convictions. His colleagues remember him as being a quiet and kind man who worked diligently and seemed in no rush to finish his shift. 10 years after beginning his career as a hospital electrician, Fuller married his third wife Marla in Barbados. They had a son together. Fuller told the police, "It's been wonderful. We have been married for 20 years. And we have been very happy. It is pretty perfect, and we are caring towards each other." Fuller's career at Kent and Sussex Hospital was on the up and up, and in March 2002, Fuller was promoted to the role of supervisor in the maintenance department where he worked until 2011. At that time, he was transferred to Tunbridge Wells Hospital, where he was employed by Interserve, a private firm that subcontracted maintenance workers. While employed as an electrical maintenance supervisor for 3 decades, David Fuller had access to all areas in the hospital, including the mortuary. Following David Fuller's arrest on December 3, 2020, investigators conducted a search of his 3-bedroom detached home in Heathfield. Hidden in hundreds of storage boxes, officers found diaries and photographs chronicling Fuller's life from the early 1980s to the present. A wardrobe was also examined, and the officers made a further discovery when they pulled out a chest of drawers which were concealed inside.
There's some stuff stuck on the back of that one as well. I've got the body worn on it, literally as it's happened.
What's that?
Well, on the back of his chest of drawers, it looks like he's got some hard drives in there, I would say.
Oh.
But they're stuck to the back of the chest of drawers. Yeah.
In the chest of drawers, there were dozens of USB sticks and floppy disks, and secured to the back of the drawers were 4 hard drives. Investigators combed through hundreds of thousands of files on 100 hard drives, 1,300 CDs, over 2,000 floppy disks, and 30 mobile phones, where they found recordings of a woman later identified as his wife's relative. Footage of the woman in the bathroom of Fuller's home had been recorded using a camera that looked like a pen. The pen camera was found in a pocket of Fuller's jacket, which was hanging in the office. The woman's face had also been photoshopped onto other images, once taken in a mortuary setting. There were also 4 million child sexual abuse images found on his storage devices. Folders titled Necrolord and Deadly contained subfolders labelled either under a woman's name or Best Yet. Images and videos contained within the folders showed Fuller sexually abusing deceased females in the mortuary of the hospitals where he worked. Fuller had also taken photographs of the mortuary logbook that had details about the women and girls he was abusing. His internet search history showed that he looked them up when he got home. Over a 15-year period, Fuller recorded himself violating victims aged between 9 and 100 years old as they lay dead in the morgue. The graphic images and videos showed him maneuvering their corpses into different positions. The last video taken was on November 30th, 2020, 3 days before his arrest. David Fuller was interviewed in January 2021. He was asked about the footage he recorded.
I want to admit that I am admitting the offences, but I don't really want to go into detail.
Yeah. Okay.
If you appreciate that.
And what offences are you admitting, David?
As you've just described to me.
Okay. In terms of the sexual penetration of
Yes.
corpses? Okay. And do you know how many occasions, David?
No.
No. Have you been recording yourself doing those things? Recording yourself sexually penetrating the corpses?
I admit that offence, yes.
Yeah. Okay. What did you retain the recordings for?
I don't know either.
Okay. Was it for further sexual pleasure, David? You know, in the same way as somebody would keep pornography or things like that? Was it for further sexual pleasure?
No.
Although Fuller did not want to speak about the crimes or why he recorded what he did, he would claim that he had been sexually abused as a child. I'm not insane. I may have some sort of residual personality problems which I've gone a completely almost Christian life and a deadliest life altogether at the same time with no crossovers. It's just two different personalities. Fuller was a senior hospital electrician with a swipe card that gave him access to every ward and the mortuary. Maintaining the temperatures of the fridges used for storing human remains in the mortuary required him to often go to the basement level to ensure their efficiency. On most occasions, Fuller would wait until the mortuary staff had left for the evening before entering the post-mortem rooms. To preserve the deceased's dignity, there were no CCTV cameras inside the morgue. Fuller later admitted that he would look through the logbook to see if any of the deceased women had died from infectious diseases. He would then lock himself into the post-mortem room of the hospital and remove a victim from the fridges that could be accessed from either side of the adjoining receiving room. After sexually abusing the corpses, Fuller covered his tracks. Everything would be put back as it would have been before I entered, he said. Based on Fuller's own records, which included photographs, a logbook, and videos that were time-stamped, he sexually abused over 100 female corpses, on 22 occasions during his time at Kent and Sussex Hospital, and 117 during his time at Tunbridge Wells Hospital. Some of the victims were abused before their post-mortem had taken place, and within hours of their deaths. The majority of the victims had died following illnesses, accidents, or suicide. Some of them still had medical equipment attached to their bodies when they were abused. In some of the footage, Fuller uses a TENS machine he had for a back injury. The machine sends small electrical pulses through the body. He attached it to the victims and abused their bodies within hours of family members visiting them. By the time David Fuller was brought to Maidstone Crown Court in November 2021, 78 of his victims had been identified. He pleaded guilty to 51 offences, including 44 counts of abusing the bodies of 75 women and 3 girls. The other counts were for the possession of extreme pornography and prohibited images of children. For the murders of Wendy Knell and Caroline Pierce, Fuller pleaded not guilty by reason of diminished responsibility. Mrs. Justice Chima Grubb told the jury that they would be offered counselling at the end of the trial due to the distressing nature of the evidence. The prosecution's case was then opened by Duncan Atkinson QC. After detailing the murders of Wendy and Caroline in 1987, the barrister said, Fuller lived with his then wife in a staff house of Broomhill School, Tunbridge Wells, 2.5 miles from the addresses where victims were resident. He had use of a car. Car movements were observed at the time of each killing. He had connections to addresses. He had previously lived at Guildford Road. He was linked to the location where Caroline's body was recovered. His grandparents lived in Hythe. Each of the 2 women died in a strikingly similar fashion, which leads to a safe conclusion that they died at the hands of the same man. What links these 2 women is the defendant, David Fuller. Fuller's DNA was found on both victims and throughout Wendy Knell's bedroom. His shoe left a bloody footprint on her clothes, and he left a fingerprint on a plastic bag found beside her bed. The jury heard that prowlers and peeping toms that were reported in the area in 1987 had similar profiles to David Fuller, and he had the opportunity to stalk, rape, and kill both victims while his wife Sally stayed overnight at Broomhill School. Duncan Atkinson QC told the court, he now asserts that at the time of the killings he was suffering from an abnormality of mind and that his responsibility was diminished. even if the defendant can be shown to have been suffering from a mental illness. The question is whether that mental illness substantially affected his ability to perform rational judgment or exercise self-control. Fuller's necrophilia was evident from the litany of images and videos he stored in his home, and there was evidence that was the motive for killing Wendy and Caroline, as both victims had post-mortem injuries consistent with being on a hard floor. On day 4 of the trial, a forensic scientist began testifying about the enormity of DNA evidence linking Fuller to the murders. Shortly after the trial resumed from a lunch break, the proceedings were suddenly brought to a halt, as David Fuller pleaded guilty. Those who knew David Fuller were shaken by the news of his secret life. His first wife Gillian spoke with a reporter for the Sun newspaper. "It's too horrific. I can't even take it in myself yet. It's not right on so many levels. It's just not right. My children can't talk about it. They're not in a good frame of mind. What came out has been a total shock. It's their father you're talking about. They didn't know the man. I didn't know the man." Fuller's third wife, Marla, who had been living with him for 2 decades, had moved out of their home and filed for divorce before he was convicted. She said, "I couldn't carry on in that relationship. I'm too upset to even think about what was going on. I couldn't live with it. You can't imagine how distraught I am. I could not stay in that house knowing what he did and what went on in there. I wanted to be alone and want to live my life alone." David Fuller was brought back to Maidstone Crown Court to be sentenced on December 15, 2021. Wendy Knell's mother Pam read her victim personal statement to the court. "You never expect to be told your daughter is dead. I went into autopilot. I was in shock. I did practical things like telling the rest of the family. Since then, I have never had a good night's sleep. One lady who was older than me, who I was friends with, used to take me on the bus because I couldn't go out alone. Even now I can't go out alone. I get scared with strangers or if a man comes too close to me. Life carried on over the years, but this has always stayed with me. I always put things on the window so I can hear if people come through them. Wendy's murder ruined my life. Over the years, I hoped the person responsible would be caught. I still can't believe he's been caught. I feel like a zombie. I'm glad he can't hurt anyone else. It doesn't make it any easier." Caroline Pierce's mother, Katrina Frost, also addressed Fuller. She said, "I have had to endure 34 years of not knowing why anyone would do this. I never forgot racing across Kent having to identify the damaged body of my own flesh and blood. I can still recall the horror of seeing her body and what happened to her. She didn't deserve what happened to her or being taken away from her family. She doesn't deserve what this animal did to her. She must have been terrified when she died. Life has never been the same again." Some of the relatives of the 78 identified victims delivered victim personal statements to the court, including the mother of the youngest victim who was 9 years old when she died. Part of her mother's statement read, "I don't know how I will carry on with my life now. Most of all, my pain and guilt is because I left her there in that hospital that was supposed to be a safe place. And I can't comfort and tell her, 'I'm sorry, baby, I know what he's done.' I have nothing. No way of closure. How will I make it up to her? How will I stand by her side now? And how will I nurse that little body that has been ruined and disrespected by that vile man? I am standing up for her now in front of him. It will haunt me forever. I will go home tonight like every night and see the abuse that man has done to my baby. That man has taken everything from me. Other victims included two 16-year-old girls, family members who had died together in an accident, teachers, war veterans, a pilot, and athletes. They were all loved, and their families never imagined that once the pain and suffering some of them endured in sickness had passed, they would be abused in the most undignified way. David Fuller's eyes were fixed on the floor as the impact of his crimes was read out to him. Mrs. Justice Chima Grubb then said, "And who are you, David Fuller? You are 67 years old. In 1973 and 1976, you were convicted of dozens of burglaries committed by climbing into homes through windows. You have spent the subsequent 45 years living an outwardly mild and ordinary life. You were described as a man who was good under pressure. While in seclusion, you committed acts of the deepest darkness. Having killed two young women who were full of the promise of life, you became a vulture, picking your victims from among the dead within the hidden world of hospital mortuaries which you were left free to inhabit simply because you had a swipe card. The depravity of what you did reveals that your conscience is seared, calloused over. The sentence I'm about to pass means you will spend every day of the rest of your life in prison. For the murder of Wendy Knell, you are sentenced to life imprisonment, and the release provisions will not apply. For the murder of Caroline Pierce, you are sentenced to life imprisonment, and the release provisions will not apply. I have taken into account each of the other offences you committed in imposing sentence, and the 12 years imprisonment that those determinate sentences amount to will be served concurrently with the life sentences. Please take him down." The media gathered outside the courtroom and spoke with Detective Chief Superintendent Paul Fotheringham from the Kent and Essex Serious Crime Directorate and Wendy Knell's mother, Pam.
We are delighted with the sentence. The seriousness of the offending has been recognised by the judge. To get 2 whole life terrorists when there are so little of those across the country demonstrates the seriousness of the offending. Not just the murders from 34 years ago. It's the 34th anniversary of Caroline's body being found today, and this has been living with the families for the last 34 years as if it had just happened. The mortuary offences just demonstrate what a monster this man is, and the judge described him as a vulture picking over the bodies of the dead.
I can't think how horrible he is, what to say about him. You know what I mean? It's something I'd never expect anybody to do.
He seems very cold in there.
He never looks up, he just sits there the whole time.
We still don't know what happened to Caroline in those 3 weeks. We've asked to see David Fuller in prison to ask him to tell us so that we can tell Caroline's family, and he's refused to do that.
So where are we now? Work to identify the remaining victims of David Fuller's necrophilia continued. On October 4th, 2022, Fuller was charged with 16 more offences, including the sexual penetration of a corpse and possessing extreme pornographic images after 23 more victims were identified. He pleaded guilty to all counts and was brought to the Central Criminal Court on December 7th. Mrs. Justice Chima Grubb's sentencing remarks were broadcast from the Old Bailey.
Among those you abused were women who had led fulfilling and rich lives. They were the best. One had flown across the Atlantic in a propeller plane via Iceland. Another was a talented skier. One had worked at Bletchley Park during World War II. Many had long and happy marriages. A number worked hard in professions such as teaching or in the NHS, caring for others and looking after the interests of their students, clients and patients. All had families that they nurtured and loved. Some spent the last part of their lives in suffering, whether through disease or old age, but they didn't lose their dignity until you decided to take it from them. Your victims are not all among the dead. They fill this courtroom and other places which are connected to this court by video link. The court has heard of the impact on these families. When members of Kent Police's family engagement team visited to break the news, it was incomprehensible to them. How could their loved ones be so violated in a place which was meant to care for them and keep them in peace?
Fuller received 4 more years to his sentence.
In my judgment, each of these offences was of high culpability, all of them the highest possible blameworthiness. The offences committed in the mortuaries involved an astonishing breach of trust and invasion of privacy, which was repeated so much that it became habitual. The dead bodies of women were used for your sexual gratification. Each was recorded, and some were further manipulated when reduced to digital images. The mortuary offences were also of the highest category of harm, as the impact statements the court has heard have testified. You have no regard for the dignity of the dead. Women who had recently died were attacked at a time when they were utterly alone and unable to resist or report your exploitation. As you well knew, those who cared for them were mourning their loss at the very time you were abusing them.
"24-year-old Azra Kamal had fallen from a motorway bridge after an accident caused her car to catch on fire. On July 16, 2020, Kent Police tweeted about the incident. A really busy morning for all at the Kent CSIs. With the wonders of modern technology, we were able to identify a deceased person within about 90 minutes of being at the scene by sending an image of a fingerprint to our FP bureau. Great teamwork." The tweet was accompanied by a GIF from the movie Top Gun showing the main characters high-fiving in celebration. Kent Police were criticised for the social media post. In an interview with Sky News, Azra's mother Nevres described the tweet as horrendous. "I could not believe that professional police officers would high-five themselves and pat themselves on the back of my daughter's demise," she said. "It's more than insensitive. It's unacceptable. What is the mindset of people investigating crimes on our behalf?" Nevres's grief and heartbreak were compounded years later when she learned that after her daughter's remains were taken to Tunbridge Wells Hospital, Azra's body was sexually abused by David Fuller. Nevres spoke about wanting to kill him after she was informed of what he had done. In comments widely reported, she said, "I spent 2 hours in the mortuary sleeping with her, and that gave me some sort of comfort. Little did I know that my daughter had been violated prior to that day and the evening of that day. So while I'm stroking my daughter's hair, a man had crawled all over her skin. And there's me kissing and cuddling and saying my last goodbyes." When she was told what Fuller had done, Nevres left her house with a knife. She explained, My only thought was, he's not going to get away with this. I'd just been told he'd raped her in hospital when she was dead. It was incomprehensible. I felt I had to take things into my own hands. Find him. Punish him. I'm her mother. But as I walked towards the police station, all hell broke loose. Police officers seemed to spring from everywhere. I was handcuffed and thrown to the floor by 8 or 9 of them. 2 officers who had come to the house had telephoned in and said I was running around with a knife. But the police who arrested me didn't know what had happened. I was crying my daughter was raped in hospital and she's dead. Everest told a reporter for the Daily Mail that when the officers learned what had prompted her outburst, they tried to get family liaison officers to help her. She added, "When they knew what had happened to Azra, they were softer to me. One officer in the custody area was crying as she took my fingerprints, photographs, and DNA. She said, 'It's awful. We can't believe it. We'd never heard anything such as this.'" Hundreds of relatives of people who had been in the mortuaries David Fuller had access to called a helpline to find out if their loved ones had been abused. While 101 victims had been identified, 10 women were not. The ripple effect of Fuller's actions was far-reaching. 20-year-old Jay Carr died at the end of summer 2022. At an inquest into his death, the coroner said, Jay Carr took his own life by way of hanging at Holly Hill Wood and was found deceased on September 20th, 2022. His mental health had deteriorated since October after he learnt of facts about his late mother. It's a conclusion of suicide. An independent inquiry into Fuller's actions within the hospitals was published on November 28, 2023. The author of the report, Sir Jonathan Michael, spoke with the family members of 33 of Fuller's victims. They felt as though they had been forced to grieve all over again, and that the practices in the hospitals allowed Fuller to get away with offending until his arrest. The daughter of one of the victims said, "I have lost any trust in the NHS. The fact that in a very new and high-tech hospital such as this one, David Fuller was able repeatedly to carry out these heinous crimes. That his time and whereabouts were clearly not recorded. That he was able to use his mobile phone recording devices in the mortuary. That there was no CCTV. That his criminal records bureau checks were not adequate. So much needs to be done to ensure that the dead and vulnerable are never made victims like this again." The victim's brother also remarked, "She had her dignity stolen from her in the very place she should have been at peace and safe. And that is the awful thing now, because it's been impacted with so many other things. So it's worse than the original grief, to be honest, because there's all this other guilt and awfulness that you're dealing with. He has distorted and stolen our hopes of happy memories. I can't tell you how much I despise him because of his sickening actions. Every thought of her is irrevocably scarred. It's like having a beautiful photograph of her which is damaged in some way." Almost all of the victims' family members felt let down by the sentence Fuller received. One said, 3 months for this, 4 months for that. I mean, if he hadn't had gone down for life, we'd reckon he'd have got 12 years. He would have been out in 6. It was nothing. And we were saying that more or less now that a corpse doesn't have any rights. I mean, that corpse was a person. The poor thing wasn't given a chance to say yes or no. It's unthinkable, isn't it? The stepfather of one of Fuller's youngest victims echoed the sentiments of many others. They had decided to remain anonymous because of how the abuse had made them feel. Quote, "It's not our shame, but it is. The shame that is attached to this. It's breaking us. We don't want the shame attached to the family, and it's a misguided shame. It is. But it is shame. It shouldn't be. You know, losing the child, that was hard. That was hard enough. I've lost her twice. We've had to take photos down of my daughter because we can't look at them. I can't tell the others. I don't want her remembered for that. And that's what it will be. She'll always be the girl that was raped by the monster, not my daughter anymore." The inquiry found that David Fuller was employed in an NHS hospital as an electrician just 2 years after killing Caroline Pierce and Wendy Knell, and continued to work there for 31 years. His visits to the mortuary were not monitored or questioned, despite entering the mortuary 444 times between December 2019 and his arrest in December 2020. The victims' remains had been left out of the mortuary fridges in most cases, and remained out while Fuller was in the mortuary. There was also no CCTV in the area, and in Fuller's own words to the report's author, Sir Jonathan Michael, "If it was in place, then it wouldn't have been possible, no matter what mental state I was in, to actually carry out anything illegal." When in to serve, the company that Fuller worked for learned that he had prior convictions. They did not notify the NHS Trust. Sir Jonathan said, "Although he might not have been barred from continuing his employment, we consider that knowledge of his convictions could have led to questions about his honesty and closer scrutiny of his actions when taken together with his other behaviour." Fuller was in the hospital longer than he was scheduled to work, and even when he was told he wouldn't be paid overtime, Fuller said he would stay because of problems at home. This was never questioned. Sir Jonathan added, "Failures of management, of governance, of regulation, failure to follow standard policies and procedures, together with a persistent lack of curiosity, all contributed to the creation of the environment in which he was able to offend, and to do so for 15 years without ever being suspected or caught." In December 2022, a voluntary compensation scheme was set up by Maidstone and Tunbridge Wells NHS Trust. In a statement by Dean Wilson solicitors who represent 80 of Fuller's victims, they wrote, "The Trust does not admit that it is legally liable to pay damages to close family members of the deceased victims of Fuller. However, the Trust recognises that close family members of the deceased victims have arguable claims under the Human Rights Act 1998 against the defendant, and the protocol is intended to deal with the compensation of those arguable claims." The compensation scheme was reopened in January 2024 to allow victims who are unable to claim compensation a chance to do so before April. If David Fuller's DNA had not been found during a forensic review of one of the UK's longest-running unsolved murder cases, he may have continued to abuse deceased victims. 10 of his victims remain unidentified, and although Fuller worked in hospitals for 16 years before he recorded himself abusing female bodies in the mortuary, no evidence of further crimes has been found. Thank you for listening, and special thanks to our patrons for their support. For more information on this episode, please see the show notes or visit our website, theywalkamonguspodcast.com.